Hey everybody, so welcome to session 17. I know it's been a little bit more days between my last one and doing this one, and that's because this by far is probably the most difficult, not so much because of the scriptures not making sense so much as to what in the world does it all mean, and there's some really different ideas about it. And I'm going to be very candid with you that I will be the least dogmatic about this section because there's just some really good scholars on all sides that make some really good points. However, I do think there are some things that we can be fairly certain about in terms of how it all fits together and especially how it ends. And I will point that out. So, this is Daniel chapters 10, 11, and 12. So if you have your Bibles, open up there and let me start with some things that I think are fairly certain. And if this video is a little bit choppy, it's because I may start and stop a few times to make sure I can pull up some different things and show them to you. But in chapter 10, something happens, and I think it's fairly certain that we can argue that I believe that chapter 10 is a vision or um, a prophecy, if you will, that comes from Jesus himself. And if you read all of chapter 10, you will notice that it pretty much just describes this encounter that Daniel happens with this person. And so I'm going to read a little bit from there and show it to you. Let me go here into our slides and remind you of some of the history and the timeline and what's happening, and then make an argument. Don't get too far ahead in reading this whole slide here, because I'm going to go back and forth with the scriptures and show you some things. But Daniel chapters 10, 11, and 12, I'm totally convinced that they all go together and they're one vision. And let me explain to you in chapter 10 why I think that's the case. It starts by saying it's in the third year of King Cyrus. You'll see that in Daniel chapter 10, verse 1. He's the king of Persia. It says, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belshazzar. The message was true, but the appointed time was long, and he understood the message and had understanding of the vision. Now, I'm going to skip over here to scripture, and I want to show you something. So hold on just a second. So here's the passage. On the left side, of course, is my trusty King James, New King James that I like to use. But I want you to see something over here in the Complete Jewish Bible, because this will maybe help explain what I'm trying to get across here in Daniel chapter 10, verse 1. And notice what it says in this. It says, in the third year of Koresh, which is Cyrus, or Kyrish, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, also called Belshazzar. The word was certain, a great war. He understood the word, having gained understanding in the vision. Now that's a completely different meaning if you compare a great war. Notice over here what the King James says, but the appointed time was long. Very different meaning that the New King James translators took from that. But you will see, if you have a New King James Bible, there's an asterisk beside that, and it will jump down and it'll explain to you, and it will say that it means of a great conflict. So that already begins to be really interesting, because you have to ask the question, well, is this saying that this is a vision that's a long time in the future, which it actually does say later in chapter 10, or is this kind of continuing somewhat the vision from chapter 9, which was in the first year of King Cyrus, that referred to this great war? It says, until the end of the war of desolations are determined. So is this possibly a reference to the end of what's happening? And that's the debate. There's great debate here about when does chapter 11 and 12 take place. In other words, is it in the past, or is it some in the past, or some in the future, or is it all in the future? And there's good arguments to be made for all three of those cases. Maybe not so much the first one that it's all in the past, but certainly something changes in there, and I'll try to point that out as we go along, and hopefully that will make sense. But I want you to notice something just historically real quick here. This is the 3rd year of Cyrus. This would mean that most likely the first return of Jewish people under Zerubbabel has already begun. Now that's interesting, because now you have to understand from a prophetic standpoint, Daniel is already thinking, okay, Jeremiah's 70 years are over, my people are beginning to return to Jerusalem. So he's going to think in terms of Jerusalem and Israel being back in its land. So obviously in his mind, all of this stuff is going to be future for sure. He's not referring to anything in the past. The question is, well, how far into the future is this all looking? And again, there's a lot of different ideas about that. Now I want to show you something, and I know I've brought this up before, but I want to point it out to you again because I think this is probably what could be happening in the book of Daniel. So hold on and let me show you something. I'm going to go back to Isaiah and show you something. So this is back in Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1, and this is the scroll that Jesus unrolled when he went into the synagogue early in his ministry. And he read this, and remember what he said, this day this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. So he himself is saying that Isaiah 61 is a reference to him. So that's the important thing to remember. Now here's what I want you to remember about this. He read and he stopped in the middle of chapter 2. And let me show you. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. And then he stopped, and that's when he told everybody, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. But notice that Isaiah goes on. Look what the very next phrase says. And the day of vengeance of our God. Now Jesus didn't read that part. And that's really, really interesting, because there's that word and in there. It says, and the day, the day of vengeance of our God. Most everybody would acknowledge that Jesus stopped this point because his first coming was not about vengeance. He didn't come to pour out his vengeance yet. That's the future day of the Lord. So what I believe, and I think what a lot of scholars believe, is that Jesus basically is showing us right here in the book of Isaiah that a verse, a phrase, can literally apply to his first coming and to his second coming. And that's interesting because, as we all know, there's a huge gap of time in there. We haven't seen his second coming yet. So Scripture, in other words, can shift gears on a dime. It can totally change from first coming to second coming overnight. It can just as easily shift from past to the present of that day to a future day as well. And I remind you of that because I think there's a really good possibility that that's what's going on in the book of Daniel, here especially in chapters 10 and especially chapter 11. And it can be talking about something that was past. It would have been future to Daniel, but it's past to us now, but then shifts gears to the future. And I think that piggybacks right on chapter 9, because remember I argued that chapter 9 does that same thing, that it's talking about the time of the 483 years up till Jesus, and then there's that 1 year, or that 1 week that's left, which is a 7-year period, that's still out there hanging, that needs to be fulfilled yet. And so I think Ezekiel is following in good prophetic tradition. that the prophets did this, that they could very easily shift gears from past to present, and from present to future. And Jesus himself showed us that when he spoke this word from Isaiah 61. So just wanted you to remember that and to keep that thought in the back of your mind. I could give you many other examples, but that's one of the most vivid examples because Jesus himself obviously knew that about his ministry. He knew that he had come to preach the good tidings and heal the brokenhearted, but he knew that his vengeance wasn't yet. In fact, he even said that he didn't come to judge the world, that's going to come down in the future. In fact, when the disciples asked Jesus after he was resurrected, are you going to restore the kingdom now to Israel? And Jesus doesn't rebuke them for that. He just says it's not for you to know the times. So he affirms that yes, that's part of his ministry, but that's the future. That's the vengeance when he comes back and he carries out his judgment upon the world. So with that, let's go back now to the book of Daniel and try to make some sense out of what it's maybe saying and what some of the different ideas of it were. So I want to go ahead and read in chapter 10 now, and as I already alluded to in my introduction here, I think chapter 10 is actually Jesus himself speaking to Daniel. It could be an angel that's that Jesus is speaking through the angel, and we've had angels already in the book of Daniel. But as you go along here, I think you'll understand why I think that this is actually Jesus himself now speaking to Daniel. It doesn't really change that much in terms of what it all means, except that I think it gives it a little bit more power that this is actually Jesus the Messiah revealing to Daniel last days stuff. It's a lot like John in the New Testament, I think, what's happening here. So anyway, let's pick up the story. It says it's the third year, which I read. And in those days, here in verse 2, in those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. And I ate no pleasant food, nor meat or wine came into my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all, till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. So for whatever reason, he was fasting intensely before the Lord, and we don't know the context as to why this happens in the third year now, because that vision in Daniel chapter 9 was in Cyrus's first year, but now this is 3 years later, or at least 2 years later. It's in the third year, it says. So whatever reason, Daniel just felt led of the Lord to do this. And notice what happens beginning in verse 4 now, right here. Now, on the 24th day of the first month, so he's most likely referring to the Jewish calendar, although it could be that he's referring to the 24th day of Cyrus's third year. There's both those sides that could be doing that. It says, as I was by the side of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose waist was girded with gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like torches of fire, his arms and feet like burnished bronze in color, and the sound of his words like the voice of a multitude. So this is definitely the most descriptive picture we've had of a being that Daniel is seeing. And the fact that it's referred to a man, and as I keep reading here, I think that you're going to understand why I at least believe that this is actually Jesus who's going to talk now to Daniel. Verse 7, and I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. Let me get this moved up here. For the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great terror fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. It reminds you a little bit of when Jesus appeared to Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus. Remember that? And he appears to Paul. The others kind of hear some thunder, but they don't see the vision. Only Paul actually experiences the encounter with Christ. So this is, this would be typical of how Jesus would obviously appear to somebody. He's personal. He speaks right to Daniel in this case. Verse 8, therefore I was left alone when I saw this great vision, and no strength remained in me, for my vigor was turned to frailty in me, and I retained no strength. Yet I heard the sound of his words. And while I heard the sounds of his words, I was in a deep sleep on my face with my face to the ground. Most people will kind of draw this as Daniel's basically on all fours. He's on his knees with his hands, and he's asleep in that form. Or it could be that he's completely prostrate, laying on the ground. And then verse 10, he would be lifted up to all fours, and then eventually he'll stand up completely. But in verse 10, suddenly a hand touched me, which made me tremble on my knees and on the palms of my hands. So definitely here, in verse 10, he's at least on, kind of like in the dog position. If you think about a dog on all fours, that's what Daniel, he's there. And what did this person say to him? And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you. While he was speaking this word to me, I stood trembling. So Daniel completely stands up now. And again, whether he started on his face completely flat or on all fours and then standing up, not overly important, but definitely he was overwhelmed by the presence of God. And then he stands up completely here. And this person who we have this incredible description of begins to speak, and he talked to him. So verse 12 now. Then he said to me, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard. Now, stop right there. What's the first day? All kinds of debate about that. Is it the first day of this 24 days that 21 days that he's been fasting, and now it's the 24th day? Or is this referring all the way back to that awesome prayer in Daniel chapter 9, where he set his heart to understand and to humble himself? Remember, that prayer was a very powerful prayer of humility before the Lord and for his nation Israel. Or it could refer all the way back to the very beginning of his ministry, when he set his heart to understand. Who knows? But I think the context and I think the idea probably fits better with the idea of the beginning of this fast that we have in Daniel chapter 10. So it would be the beginning of this 3-week period. So he's really wanting to understand. But it wouldn't surprise me if he is referring back to that vision of Daniel chapter 9, because that was overwhelming to Daniel. And he's probably been seeking the Lord for some time as to what does this 490 years things mean? What is all this about, and the 7 years? And he probably was totally like, God, I want more understanding. I need to know what this means. So verse 13, and this is why I think the context, actually tells us that it's probably the first day is actually probably the beginning of the 3 years. But still, that wouldn't take away the fact that Daniel's definitely been seeking the Lord since Daniel chapter 9 as to what in the world is this vision all about. So this person is speaking, and again, I believe it's Jesus. So let's continue reading what he says. Verse 13, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. And behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. Now, Michael is usually considered like the protecting angel of Israel. So that would make sense. He's like a chief prince or priest angel that oversees, in the heavenlies, oversees Israel. And then there's this kingdom of the Persia withstood me. So obviously that's referring in the spirit realm, because this is a spirit person talking. This isn't an actual person. So if it's Jesus speaking, he's saying that there is a spiritual entity that's behind the Persia, the kingdom of Persia, which is probably telling that there probably are, if you will, archangels assigned to every country of the world. And they probably have sub-angels underneath them that do God's work for within that nation. But this is apparently some kind of a battle where the king of Persia is fighting against Jesus himself, which is kind of interesting. It kind of reminds you back of the, Jacob wrestling with God, that there is this wrestling that happens in the spirit world. So it's just It's just kind of an interesting thing to think about. But anyway, he continues to speak, verse 14. Now I have come to make you understand. So after this 3-week period, he's come. And what will happen to your people, the Jews, in the latter days. For the vision refers to many days yet to come. So this entity, who I believe is Jesus, has just told Daniel, I'm going to show you a vision now that refers to the latter days. I think that's really, really important to understand and to keep in mind what's going on here. Verse 15, when he had spoken such words to me, I turned my face toward the ground and became speechless. And suddenly, one having the likeness of the sons of men touched my lips. Then I opened my mouth and spoke, saying to him who stood before me, my Lord, because of the vision my sorrows have overwhelmed me, and I have retained no strength. For how can the servant of my Lord talk with you, my Lord? As for me, no strength remains in me now, nor is any breath left in me. Then again, verse 18, the one having the likeness of man touched me and strengthened me. So the debate is there another person in chapter 15, another angel that touches Daniel's lips? Or is this Jesus himself? Again, it doesn't really, I don't know that it really matters that much as to who's who. But the fact that Daniel is referring to this person as Lord, again, that's why I think it's pretty obvious that he's understanding he's having an encounter with God himself. And obviously specifically because I'm a firm believer that God is spirit and that Jesus is the earthly, if you will, the fleshly manifestation of God. That's why I would argue that this is probably what we would call a theophany. This is Jesus who is speaking to Daniel. In any event, in verse 18, it says, then again, the one having the likeness of a man touched me. So I lean towards this is all just Jesus in all three of these cases, but there might have been another angel involved. But in any sense, in verse 19, and he said, O man, greatly beloved, fear not, peace be to you, be strong, yes, be strong. And I think that's, again, Jesus speaking to Daniel. So when he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. Then he said, this is Jesus speaking to Daniel, or the angel, do you know I have come to you? And now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia, and when I have gone, indeed the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth. No one upholds me against these except Michael your prince. And also in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and to strengthen him. Now this is where it gets complicated, but it doesn't need to be. And the reason it gets complicated is because it says, well, wait a minute. Now in chapter 11, verse 1, which is right here, because I don't know if you noticed this, but we switched from chapter 10 to chapter 11. It says, now we're in the first year of Darius. So then what we're going to read now in chapters 11 and 12 must be the first year. Here's two problems with that. Number one, Daniel chapter 10 never said anything of the vision itself. All Daniel chapter 10 was a revelation of who is speaking to Daniel. Again, I lean towards it's Jesus, but if it's an angel, fine. But nonetheless, the vision itself is never given to Daniel in chapter 10. So chapters 11 and 12 have to be connected to chapter 10 because the vision still needs to be given. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what's happening is that this angel, or Jesus, is referring back to the first year of Darius when he had to kind of help stand against the king of Persia, and he helped in that vision in the first year. So what he's basically doing, he's connecting this vision back to the vision in Daniel chapter 9, because remember the vision in Daniel chapter 9 was in the first year of Darius, and so which would have been the first year of Cyrus as well. So this is Jesus connecting these 2 points and saying, hey, it's just like that first time when I sent you Gabriel. I was fighting against Persia, but I was there. I was fighting against nobody was coming against me because I'm God, in other words. And the only one that was helping me was Michael. And of course, then he sent Gabriel to him. And that was in the first year of Darius. And Jesus is saying, I stood up to strengthen him. So that's important to understand, that he's pointing out that these two visions go together. So that's why you'll see, even in the New King James, there's like a parenthesis there. Because this isn't a new vision, this is just a reference back to that one in Daniel chapter 9. You'll see in the complete Jewish Bible, it says in Daniel chapter 1, however, I was already standing up to support and help Darius the Mede in the first year of his reign. So that's the same type of a concept. It just doesn't use the idea of the parentheses, but nonetheless, it's referring to, here's the vision now I'm going to give you. And it ties back to that one in Daniel chapter 9. I think that's kind of the important thing to see. So here's where it gets interesting now, because the debate is, if this is about end times, and as I showed you in the complete Jewish Bible, the way that the Hebrew reads, that it might refer to long in the first verse, but it also could refer to a great war. The debate is Daniel chapter 11 all future, or is this something that has some things that happened in the past, and is there a future still coming? Now, I'm going to show you that it definitely switches to the future at some point, for sure. But I do want you to be aware, there are some scholars and there are some people who argue fairly persuasively. I don't know that I necessarily agree with them, but they argue that all of Daniel chapters 11 and 12 are all future. They're all Antichrist stuff. And here's why they say that. Let me read a little bit, and then I'll stop and I'll explain to you why they would say that. And then I'll tell you why other people disagree with that, and why, being honest with you, it's difficult for me to really be dogmatic as to where what's actually true. And someday I think we'll know, but at this point in time, I don't think we can be overly dogmatic about it. But in the first year, verse 1 or verse 2 now, and now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these. And then it gets into things of this king of the south and the king of the north, and hopefully if you've read it, you can kind of try to put that all together and see what's going on. So here's the debate, and I'll come back to some of that here in just a second. But the debate is this thing about the 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all, and then a mighty king shall arise and do according to his will. So the most common interpretation for centuries has been that this is definitely referring to the kings after Persia, and that the mighty king that arises after them is Alexander the Great. And then his kingdom, because he dies fairly young, and Greece, his kingdom gets divided into 4 parts, and it's not really to any of his posterity. It's not to any of his family. It goes to 4 different generals and things of that nature. And so they would argue then that what you're going to continue to read here in Daniel chapter 11 is what happens with Alexander, his 4 kingdoms, and then down to the branch, which would be Antiochus Epiphanes, who's one of the branches out of the Greek Empire, and then that's referring to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, and then it shifts to a future king, which I'll show you here in just a second. So that has been the most common interpretation, and it's fairly persuasive, except this thing about these 4 three more kings, and then the fourth in Persia. That makes it really difficult to argue adamantly. In fact, I'll chase one little other rabbit too. The idea of the fourth being divided into four kingdoms, that gets to be a little interesting and problematic as well, because if you've listened to any of Joel Richardson's stuff, he's done a lot of research and done a lot of reading about Greece, and it really appears that the Greek Empire actually subdivided into 5 realms, not 4. So he makes the argument that that makes this difficult. And that's one argument. But I think that even the more persuasive argument that makes this a little bit more complicated is this idea of 3 Persian kings. And then the fourth shall be richer than them all. The reason is because after Cyrus, until Alexander the Great, there's at least 8 kings, Persian kings, possibly 9. Some could be the same person. Maybe there's only 6 or 7. My point is, it's really difficult to argue that there's only 4. Now, what most scholars would come back, and you won't read this, and when you read a lot of commentaries, they will be very adamant that this, like the people that take this approach that it's already been fulfilled, they will be very persuasive, and they won't mention to you that, well, were more than 4 kings. There were, this says there's 3 and then a 4th one coming. They'll talk about kind of like the 4 main kings and say that's the fulfillment of it. And so you say, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. So it's all settled, right? Well, the problem is they've made an interpretation, which could be correct, but they've made the interpretation that what God is speaking, what Jesus is speaking here to Daniel, is that there's 4 major kings, and all the other minor kings aren't really involved. And honestly, it's pretty hard to argue that there's 4 major ones. If anything, there's 5 major ones, but that's separate from Greece. So, but that's what you would have to do to make that work, because you could not argue that there's literally 4, because there's more than 4. So that's why there are a lot of people, and more people, have pointed this out and have stepped back a little bit and say, you know what? Could all of Daniel chapter 11 be a reference to what we're going to see happen at some point when this Antichrist begins to power, or kind of the prelude, if you will, to the Antichrist? In other words, is this a future reference to the fact that you're going to have some kings, 3 kings, then a 4th, and that's going to be fulfilled in maybe in our lifetime or at some future, that applies to the area of Persia, which would be Iran, and Greek, which could be the whole area of Greece or Turkey, and that kind of area. And that's something that's yet to be fulfilled. And it's an interesting argument. There's actually whole books that have been written about that particular stance, and they're very interesting. Again, the difficulty with all of it is nobody can really be very, very dogmatic about what does it actually apply to for certain. And so, and when they try to tell you that they are, I would just caution you to say, okay, that makes sense, but be careful, because there's just a lot of other ways that this might work. So I point that out to you, and that's what makes Daniel's chapter 11 especially so difficult to be really adamant with you about, well, what does it actually mean? What's going on here? Is it past, it's already been fulfilled, or is it still future? So I hope I made that clear. Hopefully I didn't lose anybody in all of this. So here's what begins to happen then in chapter 11. It continues on with whatever this whatever this great king that comes up, and then it gets split into the 4 winds of heaven, and it begins to talk about all the dilemmas that's going on with that kingdom. Again, if you're of the mindset that it's Alexander the Great, then you'll take and you'll make all these ideas about the king of the south, which would be Egypt, and king of the north, which is probably up in the Turkey area, or in that day and time, who knows how far north they might have been referring to, but it would refer to probably Antiochus himself that came down from the north, and it's going to refer to that. If it's all future still to happen, it's probably talking about Egypt in the south and Turkey in the north, possibly Russia, but most people would say no, that doesn't really fit the context because Russia wasn't a part of Greece. And it does say here it looks at the realm of Greece. So in other words, they would argue it's telling us the regions, but of course we don't call them today Persia and Greece. We would call them more Iran and Turkey. That's how we would take a look at them. So that's more where the people with the future mindset go with it all. And so it talks about this dilemma. And there really is good historical, when you kind of study out what happened with Alexander the Great and with the Persian kings and that kind of stuff, you actually can make it fit what's going on here with these kings of the north and the kings of the south. To a point. Again, the problem is, but there were more than 4 Persian kings, so that kind of gets confusing. And as others have noted, there's probably more than 4 Greek divisions, although the fact that 4 of them are kind of referred to in history, that's why they would make sense. But nonetheless, as you read through it and you kind of see this dilemma of what's going on, all this war and this battle that's going on, you will continue to read, and the only thing you can really do is ask yourself, is this referring to past stuff that's been fulfilled, or is it future stuff that's going to get fulfilled? That's kind of the big question. So anyway, that's going on in all of this framework. And by the way, if it is future, it actually is really fascinating, because that means that whenever we get to the point where some of this stuff starts happening, this will probably start making a lot of sense, because we'll see all these things about the kingdom of the south and the kingdom of the north and a prince and a princess that's involved. And when we start seeing things like that happen, we might have a really good clue as to, oh, this is a real prelude to the fact that we're getting closer to the end days. Now, it still never gives us anything definitive about time frame, and where Jesus' second coming would fit within all that. But it at least would give us a really good clue as to, hey, things are really happening. And that's one of the reasons why I've said many times, I think we got to be careful to say that we're in the last days just yet. In terms of the very last days, we've always been in the last days. But in terms of the very last days, and especially to argue that we're within that that last week of Daniel, I don't think we could say that we're there yet, just because there's so many things that kind of still need to transpire and take place. So that's what's kind of important. So anyway, as you're going through it, the next debate that comes up is in Daniel chapter 11, verse 20, because now it refers to another person. It says, "Then there shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue." So verse 20 is the one, and 21 is the one where the biggest debate comes, because now people that believe this is all historical, they will say, well, this is clearly referring to, in verse 21, the vile person. That's going to be Antiochus Epiphanes, excuse me, who's going to fulfill that. He's the one that's going to take over now for all these, all the line of the different Greek leaders and stuff like that. Whereas the people who are more future-oriented, they're going to say, no, now we definitely have a shift in verse 21 to a Antichrist figure. And the debates are just endless about where they're going with this. Now, I lean towards the latter argument, meaning I believe in verse 21, you definitely have a shift to the Antichrist. Some people will even argue, no, you don't even see that shift until verse 36. But I think verse 36 is just a continuation. So in other words, I think the shift happens here in verses 21. So let me put it this way. Verses 20 and 21 are that same kind of a thing that you saw in Isaiah, where you had one part of the verse referred to Jesus' first coming, and the second part referred to his second coming. I think in verse 20 and 21, you have most likely, if it's the historical, if it's past, you had references that were referring to Antiochus Epiphanes, and in chapter 21, it now shifts time and it shifts to the Antichrist. Or it could be that if Daniel's chapter 11 verses 1 through 20 are all future, it could be that we have all this prelude of different kings and things going on in the Middle East that lead up to an Antichrist figure, and in verse 21 is where it definitely shifts to the Antichrist. And here's why I make that argument. Notice what it says about this person. It says, "In his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of glory," or royalty, "but he shall come in peaceably, and seize the kingdom by intrigue. With the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province. He shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time." To me, this sounds like that person referred to in Daniel chapter 9, the prince who is to come, who is going to bring in a covenant. Notice what it said here in verse 22, the prince of the covenant. So this sounds like that person that comes in and has a peace covenant with Israel. So he comes in peacefully and does that. And see, that doesn't describe Antiochus Epiphanes. That's not how he came to power. He was very much a man of war. But this is somebody, and it's a vile person from the beginning, but who's very tricky. And he brings about peace. And he was able to kind of win over people, which his forefathers were never able to do. And again, if some of us are right about the fact that this could refer very easily to a Muslim Antichrist figure, I mean, who we would refer to an Antichrist, this would totally make sense because he brings prosperity to the Muslim people, to Islam, and he somehow forges a peace with Israel, and everybody's just thrilled. Everybody's happy. Oh, finally we've got, Middle East peace. Everything's wonderful and great. And so it's done deceitfully, because inside of his heart he's not like that. But at least in the beginning, that's how it looks. So I think that's why from verse 21 forward, we are now talking about the Antichrist. Again, verses 1 through 20, I'm not as clear about in terms of if that's past and now we have a break, or if that's all future as well. But I don't think it really changes that much from verses 21 forward. I think we can safely argue that chapters 21 forward are definitely Antichrist type of a stuff. And it's interesting because then he kind of does the same things as these other leaders did in the first 20 verses, because look at verse 25. Notice what he does. He will stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. So it looks like the lot of the talk that you've all heard about, like the Antichrist, is going to put this whole world together in one piece. It's not going to, if it's going to be the whole world, which I don't believe it's the whole world, I think it's going to be the Middle East world. But even if it's just the Middle East world, it doesn't happen right away. Because notice, he's got some battles. He's got to win over the Egyptians. He's got to win over the kings of the south. Most likely that's it isn't. Maybe it's Ethiopia. Maybe it's kings further south than even that. But nonetheless, he has to kind of at some point begin to take over rest of the Middle East and get them all in line with who his who his leaders will be. So that's, I think, where it's going to happen. Anyway, he has success against the kings of the south. He takes them over. And verse 28, while returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. So he shall do damage and return to his own land. So he made the covenant with Israel. Then he has this war, I think, with Egypt or some kings of the south somewhere. Now his true colors begin to come out, and he's moved against the holy covenant. So not only is he moved against Israel and their election as God's people, but he's moved against this peace covenant that he made with them as well. So you begin to realize that he's not completely all together here. He's going to do some things. So 29, verse 29, at the appointed time he shall return and go towards the south. So he's going to go back down to the south again. But it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So other people in the world begin to now come to the help of Egypt. Do you see that? Ships from Cyprus come. This is the one place where some people argue, could this possibly be a reference to America? Is it truly just Cyprus of old, and so it's the whole area of Cyprus back then, which would just be in the Mediterranean world today? Or is it beyond that? Is this speaking of a bigger prophetic word maybe to Gentile powers that are going to come kind of help? Either case, notice that what it does, it stirs up the Antichrist even deeper. He's grieved and he returns in rage against the Holy Covenant and to do damage. So this is where he begins, his true colors begin to show up, and that he really didn't intend for there to be peace in Israel. And he's mad now at the Holy Covenant. So he shall return. Keep reading now in verse 30. Because some other people in the world come and help. This is why you have to be careful with arguing that the Antichrist is a world power, because the world's not all united here. Obviously there are some battles going on here with this Antichrist figure. So what does he do? So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So he's going to favor people that don't follow the Jewish covenant and don't follow his covenant that he made with them, that peace treaty that he made. So he's going to go back on his word, in other words. Verse 31, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. So here you have, I think, a clear reference to the midpoint of the 7 years. So at all these other things that we've read in Daniel chapter 11, I certainly believe from verse 21 forward that it's the first 3.5 years, but it could be that verses 1 through 20 also happen within that first 3.5 years. In other words, it's interesting that I'm not sure we're really clear as to when the 7 years begins. The 3.5 years are what are really clear in Scripture, and that begins when the abomination of desolation takes place. Well, here we have another reference to that abomination of desolation. And remember, Jesus referred to this as that's going to be the sign. When you see the abomination of desolation set up in the temple, then you're going to know that, the time is really short by that point. So I think that's what's happening here. And that's why I think it's pretty clear that this is a reference to the Antichrist. So he's stirred up, he forsakes the covenant, he goes into the temple, he sets up the abomination. Those who do wickedly against the covenant he will corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. That's a word of hope. That's a word of hope to the Jewish people that do know God, and they're going to be the ones that do turn and see Jesus as the Messiah when he comes back. It's also a reference to Christians who stay strong during all of this, even though this Antichrist is going to really stir up people that are against the covenant. There's going to be still God's voice. His voice never is lost in the middle of all this, even in the worst of times. And verse 33, and those of the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, and by captivity and plundering. And remember, that's what Jesus told us when the abomination of desolation is set up, that it's going to be a horrible time for his elect, for his people. They're going to be, tribulated against. I don't know if that's the right use of that word, but they're going to suffer tribulation. They're going to suffer death. There's going to be a lot of persecution against them. There's going to be a lot of martyrs that are taking place during this time period. But yet, they're going to continue to stay true to preach the word. Not all of them, but there's going to be this remnant, this group of people that are going to stay true, and they're going to do that. So that's cool. That's, encouraging to know that they're going to stand strong, and they're going to be strong. And they're actually even going to gain some followers. Look what it says. Now, when they fall, right here, when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join them by intrigue. So that's cool. Now, verse 35, and some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. So you have, I think here, something that's probably lost a lot, especially in all that Left Behind series and what a lot of teaching has been in the past. A lot of people have missed that during this Antichrist stuff, when the abomination is set up, there are still people that come to the Lord, and they gain understanding. They're persecuted, yes. They fall. Now, I know that the whole Left Behind series and everything they talk about, well, these are the people that realize that Jesus actually is, and so they turn to the Lord and they bring a lot of other people in. And that could be, but we didn't see any reference to that anywhere here in Daniel where people are suddenly taken out. This is the Jewish people, and those that follow God are taking into this whole time period. That's I think that's at least what it talks about. Okay, now neither here nor there. What do we know then more about this Antichrist? Because this is one of the best, most thorough descriptions of who this Antichrist is. In verse 36. And again, if I'm right, think about who's telling all this story. This is still Jesus speaking. And at the least, it's an angel speaking for Jesus who is speaking all this. So this is the very word of God being spoken to Daniel. Verse 36. Then the king, so then this person who has set himself up the temple, shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god. He shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. So the wrath is still God's part. So that hasn't happened yet. See, did you catch that? The wrath is still something that's going to be coming. What he's doing, what the Antichrist is doing right now, is against God's people. He's persecuting them. But God's wrath is still coming. And there's a determined time for that. Verse 37, he, meaning the Antichrist, shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all. But in their place he shall honor a god of fortresses, and a god which his fathers did not know he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. So that's a real dichotomy. And by the way, if you go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 in the New Testament, this is, I believe, Paul is referring back to this very passage. He's talking about this Antichrist figure that's going to set himself up as God. But notice what it says here, because verse 38 is so important. But in their place he shall honor a god of fortresses. So he's not an atheist. He's a person who's going to set himself up against every other god. So in other words, he does believe he's higher than Jesus. He does believe he's higher than Buddha. He believes he's higher than all other gods, if you will. He treats them all equally in his mindset. He's going to set himself up over all of those. So he believes he's better than all of them. But he still honors a god of fortresses. That's again why, if it's the last days, the whole idea of a Muslim Antichrist and Islamic Antichrist makes total sense, because that's exactly what they teach. they believe that Allah is the only God and everybody else is subject to him. So, and some people might even believe this is like a reincarnation of Muhammad himself. That might be where some people come from. Who knows? Because in their mindset, the only person higher than Muhammad is Allah. So in other words, they're real right. They believe very much there can be a person who is higher than all other gods, especially higher than Jesus, but not as high as Allah, if that makes sense. So that's what you need to see here in this passage. It's so fascinating because it really does set up the fact that this is still a person that uses religion to get what they want, just for what it's worth. Verse 39, thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. So this is when he breaks the covenant, sets himself up the temple, persecutes the Jews like crazy, takes over Jerusalem, takes over Israel, begins to give it to his people, and says we're going to be all completely, Islamic. If it's Islamic. If it's a whole nother future fulfillment, then it's something else. But the Antichrist is still going to do that same thing. He's going to set himself up. Oh, and by the way, I know I've talked about this before, this verse 37, because some people argue, it says, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God. And some people say, oh, it's going to be a homosexual. Again, I don't think you can read that into this text. I think what it says is the desire of women is to be the mother of the Messiah. So in other words, this is kind of arguing he's not going to accept the fact that the Virgin Mary gave birth to the Son of God. He's going to reject that desire of every woman. Others have argued, yeah, but it's even the fact that this person is not a real popular, doesn't think very highly of women. And of course, we know the one, well, lots of religions do, but Islam especially is very negative against women. They're second-class citizens in the whole Islamic world. So it could mean that it's referring to that. I don't think it refers to the fact that he's a homosexual, because that nobody from that standpoint would gain any real traction in the Middle East. It's going to be pretty hard. I know homosexuality is running rampant in our own country, at least the mindset of it and the acceptance of it. But in the Middle Eastern world, you're not going to have anybody that's going to be a homosexual that's going to be able to gain power, at least in our lifetime, most likely. Perhaps that could change, and maybe that is what it refers to, but I think it's probably more the idea of referring to Jesus as being born of the Virgin Mary. So I think that's probably the better thing. So anyway, that gives a really good description of the Antichrist and what he does here in the midterm of the 70th week. Begins to take over, sets up his abomination of desolation, takes away the sacrifices of the temple. So again, that's why we know we got to have a temple again. That's one of the key things that I think still needs to happen. A tabernacle or something needs to be built and begin to start doing sacrifices again. I know we don't need sacrifices again, but the Jewish people don't believe that Jesus was the fulfillment, so they're going to probably reinstall that until they realize Jesus is the pure sacrifice, and then that won't have to happen anymore. But that's probably going to happen at some point. And then in the rest of chapter 11, real quick, and then we'll come back and do Daniel chapter 12 in the next video. It says, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. So when he does this covenant and then he breaks it, it's actually going to stir up the Middle East against him, but he's going to go against them like a whirlwind, and he's going to overtake all of them. So he's definitely going to unite the whole Middle East, I think, by force. Verse 41, he shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. That's so interesting, because that tells us there's some people from the east that aren't going to follow the whole Antichrist. That's why it's pretty hard to argue that it's a worldwide domination, like the whole world is in unison and one together with this Antichrist. No. It's a good portion of the Middle East, and a lot of the world probably allows it to happen and is fine with it, but he doesn't get everybody. It's just kind of interesting. Verse 42, he shall stretch his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So even though they came against him, that's the king of the south in verse 40, he's not going to have success. So Egypt, some of the powers in that country aren't going to have success against him. And he shall have, verse 43, he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. So it sounds like a good portion of Africa is going to fall in line with this Antichrist. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. So even though he gets everybody kind of in the Middle East on his side, something from the east disturbs him, and from the north. So again, you can't argue that he's a worldwide power. Whatever confederacy he has of nations, it doesn't hold together for very long. And that's so true. Kingdom divided itself shall not stand. And we know that the Antichrist isn't going to stand. But notice what happens to his end. He's going to set up his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. So that's Israel. That's where he's going to make his capital, if you will, in Israel. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. That's why, we know this has to be an Antichrist figure, because in the end, the only people, even though he's going to have 10 nations following him and they're kind of together, no one is going to specifically help him at the end, because Jesus is going to finally destroy it all, and he's going to take this Antichrist and his false prophet and throw him into the lake of fire. So that's where no earthly power is going to save him. God himself is going to come against him and destroy him. So that's where I think, especially from chapter 11, verse 21 forward, I definitely think this is all speaking of the future. It's all speaking of the Antichrist. I think people that try to make it fit into Antiochus Epiphanes, I don't think that works. I think you could argue that the first 20 verses maybe take you to Antiochus Epiphanes, but I think from verses 21 forward, those are all clearly future references, because we haven't seen all of these things happen yet. This has not been fulfilled in the past, so it has to be a future fulfillment. And that description obviously completely describes the Antichrist. So I think that's what's happening, and that's why it dovetails with chapter 9, and why I said Jesus is telling Daniel, hey, this is kind of a continuation, more explanation of that vision I gave you back in the first year of King Darius. Now I'm going to give you some more depth as to what happens. And then chapter 12 continues on that in terms. So we're going to stop there. It's speaking now of what's going to happen, and it's going to give us some more detail about what's going to cause the end to this Antichrist figure. And here's where some specific things are told us, and why we especially know this is end days type of stuff. It already did say latter days, but chapter 12 is going to completely confirm to us that this is the last days. So we will look at that one in the next video, because I've gone a little bit long on this one. Hopefully that all made sense, and if not, go back and read and listen to it a few times, and feel free to email me any questions and whatnot. So we'll see you on the next video. Lord bless.